Calvin Brooks lived on the edge of a small town in Mississippi, far from noise, traffic, and trouble. His little farmhouse sat on 10 acres of land that once belonged to his grandfather. It was a quiet, peaceful place surrounded by open fields, tall pine trees, and the smell of earth after rain. The wooden fence around his property was old but sturdy, just like the man who owned it. To most people in town, Calvin was just Old Man Brooks, a black farmer who kept to himself. Every morning he would wake up before sunrise, feed his chickens, and walk to the barn to check on his tools and animals. His barn, though worn and weathered, stood tall like a guardian of memories, full of farm equipment, old photos, and things he had collected through the years. He didn't need much to be happy. A cup of strong coffee, his dog Rusty at his side, and a good day's work were enough. Calvin wasn't a man of many words. When he did speak, his voice was calm but carried a weight, the kind that made people listen. He moved slowly, not because of age, but because he never rushed anything. Every action had purpose. Every decision had thought behind it. People in town sometimes wondered about his past. A few older folks remembered hearing that he had served in the Marines, but no one really knew what he had done or where he had been. Calvin never talked about it. When asked, he would just smile and say, "That was another lifetime." Then he'd change the subject. Even though he lived alone, Calvin never felt lonely. His days were full of routine, fixing fences, tending the soil, and helping neighbors when they needed it. He had a gentle way with people, especially children. Sometimes when he went into town to sell vegetables at the farmer's market, kids would run up to see Rusty or ask him about his time in the service. He would chuckle, pat them on the head, and say, "Maybe one day I'll tell you a story." At night, the world around him would fall silent. The wind would whisper through the trees, and crickets would sing in the distance. Calvin would sit on his porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the stars appear one by one. He liked the quiet, it gave him peace. But deep inside, that same quiet also reminded him of something else, the stillness before battle. Years of military service had trained him to notice everything, a shift in the wind, a creak in the floor, a sudden noise that didn't belong. His senses were sharp even now. Sometimes when the nights grew too quiet, memories would come back. Flashes of places far from Mississippi, the sound of helicopters, the smell of smoke, the faces of men he had led into combat. He had seen the best and worst of humanity. That was why he came back home, to find peace, to live simply, and to keep his promises to those who didn't make it back. He had built his barn himself after retiring, using wood from old army crates and leftover beams from his father's shed. To anyone else, it was just a barn, but to Calvin, it was more than that. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could fix things, think, and remember. Inside it were signs of his past life, a Marine Corps flag hanging on the wall, a few medals in a small box, and a photo of him with his old unit. Young men standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling proudly in their uniforms. Calvin didn't show those things to anyone. He didn't need to. He had already done his duty. He had already proven himself in ways few people could understand. Now his mission was different, to live peacefully and protect what was his. But peace is a fragile thing. Calvin didn't know that trouble was slowly making its way toward his quiet corner of the world. The town had changed in recent years. Outsiders had started buying land. Strange cars were sometimes seen driving down country roads late at night. People whispered about drugs being moved through rural areas. Calvin paid attention, but he didn't worry too much. As long as no one disturbed him, he had no reason to raise his guard. Still, some habits never die. Every night before locking his doors, he would check the barn one last time, making sure everything was in place. He'd glance around the yard, noting every sound, every flicker of light. Rusty would growl sometimes, staring into the dark, but Calvin would pat his head and say softly, "It's all right, boy. Just the wind." He didn't know that soon it wouldn't be just the wind. Something dangerous was on its way. A group of men who thought they had found the perfect hiding place for their crimes. They didn't know the man who lived there had spent a lifetime training to face danger head-on. For now, though, the old Marine sat quietly on his porch, the moonlight shining on his weathered face. He breathed deeply, enjoying the stillness. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another farmer ending his day. But beneath that calm, there was still a fighter, a man who had faced fear, loss, and war, and learned that true strength doesn't fade with age. And when trouble finally came to his barn, Calvin Brooks would remind the world that some warriors never really retire. They just wait for the right moment to stand up again. The morning after another peaceful night, Calvin Brooks woke up before sunrise as usual. The rooster crowed. The air was cool and a soft fog rolled across the fields. Everything looked calm, but miles away, something dangerous was already moving toward his quiet life. In a nearby city, a cartel leader named Luis Ortega sat inside a black SUV, watching a digital map on his phone. He had been expanding his drug operation into smaller towns, looking for places where the police rarely came and people minded their own business. "We need a new drop point," he said to his men. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody looks twice." One of his scouts, a young man named Rico, spoke up. "There's this old farm about 15 miles out. Big barn, no neighbors for a mile, old black guy lives there. Nobody would suspect a thing," Luis smirked. "Perfect," he said, taking a drag from his cigar. "Old farmers don't ask questions. Make it happen." That simple order set everything in motion. The cartel didn't know it yet, but they had just chosen the wrong man. A man who had survived battles much worse than anything they could bring. For the next few days, Rico and 2 others drove past Calvin's property, pretending to be delivery men or hunters. They took pictures of the barn, the fences, and the dirt road that led to it. From a distance, Calvin looked like an easy target, an old man with a limp feeding chickens driving an old pickup truck that rattled every time he started it. Rico reported back, "He's harmless, probably lives alone. The barn is huge. Perfect for hiding shipments." Luis nodded. "Good, move in at night. Take what you need, store the goods there. If the old man causes trouble, deal with him." While the cartel planned, Calvin carried on with his life, unaware that he was being watched. Or maybe he wasn't completely unaware, because sometimes as he worked in the fields he'd notice small things. Tire tracks that weren't there before, a broken branch near the back fence, footprints in the soft dirt by the road. He didn't panic. He just watched quietly. Years of military training had taught him to recognize patterns, to sense when danger was nearby. He said nothing to anyone. He simply started locking his barn earlier, keeping his shotgun closer and letting Rusty roam the property more freely at night. One afternoon, Calvin drove into town for supplies. As he walked into the small hardware store, 2 of the cartel's men were sitting outside in a car pretending to fix a flat tire. They watched him carefully. One of them laughed quietly. "Old man doesn't even know what's coming," he said. Inside the store, the clerk, Mrs. Walker, smiled. "Morning, Mr. Brooks. You fixing up the barn again?" Calvin smiled back. "Always something to fix," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the reflection in the glass door. 2 strangers outside watching him. He didn't say anything more. That night, after feeding Rusty, Calvin sat on his porch longer than usual. He could feel something strange in the air. Not fear, but a quiet alertness. The stars above were bright and the world seemed peaceful, yet his gut told him that peace was about to break. Meanwhile, the cartel's crew met in a cheap motel room near the highway. Luis gave his final instructions. "You go in quiet, no noise. Don't hurt him unless he gets in the way. Get the barn open, unload, and be gone before sunrise." Rico nodded. "Got it, boss." They didn't know that the man they were about to rob wasn't just an old farmer. Calvin Brooks had spent half his life leading men through dangerous missions, raids, rescues, ambushes. He knew how to think like an enemy, how to anticipate every move before it happened. As night fell, the sky turned black and silent. The 3 men parked their truck half a mile away and started walking through the fields with flashlights off, dressed in dark clothes. They carried crowbars, duffel bags, and 1 pistol, just in case. Rusty's ears perked up first. The dog growled low, staring toward the fence line. Calvin, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looked up immediately. His instincts kicked in like they never left him. He reached for the shotgun behind the door and turned off the kitchen light. Through the window, he saw faint movement in the distance, shadows slipping through the field like snakes. He didn't move fast or panic. He simply whispered, "Easy, boy," to Rusty and quietly made his way to the back door. The men reached the barn and started cutting the lock. One whispered, "Told you, man, this is easy." They didn't know that every noise they made, the scrape of metal, the crunch of dirt, reached Calvin's ears like echoes of a battlefield. From inside the house, he could hear them, count them, sense their direction. He wasn't angry and just focused. A small smile crossed his face as he loaded the shotgun and muttered softly, "Wrong place, wrong man." For years, Calvin had promised himself he would never fight again. But some promises are broken when danger walks right into your home. As the lock finally snapped and the barn door creaked open, the men stepped inside, unaware that they had just entered the lair of a Marine who had once led missions in war zones far deadlier than this. The quiet life on the edge of town was about to turn into a storm, and by the time it ended, everyone would know that the old black farmer was not a man to be underestimated. The night was dark and quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made every sound feel louder, every shadow look alive. The moon hung low in the sky, half covered by clouds casting a pale silver glow across Calvin Brooks's farm. The crickets had stopped chirping and even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Inside his small farmhouse, Calvin sat by the window, his shotgun resting on his lap. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, lights off, listening. His dog Rusty lay near the door, his ears twitching, his body tense. Calvin didn't need cameras or alarms. His instincts were sharper than any technology. He could feel it. Trouble was coming. Far across the field, 3 figures moved slowly through the tall grass. Dressed in black, they carried duffel bags and tools, whispering to each other as they crept closer to the barn. They thought they were invisible. They thought the old man inside was asleep. Calvin knew exactly where they were. Years of military training had taught him to sense rhythm, footsteps, wind shifts, silence breaks. He could almost hear their heartbeat in the stillness of the night. He took a slow breath and whispered to Rusty, "Stay low, boy." The dog stayed quiet but alert, eyes locked toward the window. The men reached the fence and cut through it with bolt cutters, careful not to make too much noise. The wire snapped softly and one of them, Rico, grinned. "Told you this was going to be easy." They moved toward the barn, their shoes sinking into the soft dirt. The old wooden structure stood tall and dark, its roof half covered in vines. It looked abandoned to them, like no one had cared for it in years. Perfect for hiding their stash. What they didn't know was that Calvin had already been there earlier that evening. Something about the air had felt wrong, so he had quietly prepared. He had locked the main door but left a side entrance cracked open, a trap. He had placed an old metal bucket just inside, resting on the edge of a beam, ready to crash down at the slightest touch. He wanted to know exactly when they entered. As the men reached the door, the leader whispered, "All right, let's get this over with." The moment he pushed the door, the bucket fell with a sharp clang, loud enough to wake the dead. The men froze. What was that? One hissed, but it was too late. The sound had already reached Calvin. His eyes opened wide but calm. No fear, only focus. He stood up, cocked the shotgun and moved like a shadow through his house. Outside, the men started whispering nervously. "Relax," Rico said. "It's just an animal or something." Still, his voice trembled. The barn door creaked open and the flashlight beams cut through the darkness, landing on old tools, barrels, and a rusted tractor. They stepped inside, moving slowly. The air smelled of hay and oil. One of them noticed something odd. The floor was swept clean, too clean. "This place ain't abandoned," he muttered. At that same moment, Rusty began to growl softly from the porch. Calvin whispered again, "Easy, boy." "Not yet." He slipped out the back door, moving quietly, his boots barely touching the ground. The cool night air brushed against his face. He moved like he was back in the jungle. Slow, precise, controlled. He circled behind the barn, crouching low, his shotgun steady. Through a small gap in the wood, he could see the men inside, their lights bouncing across the walls. The leader spoke again. "Check the loft. Make sure no one's here." As one of them climbed the ladder, Calvin took a deep breath. His mind was clear, heart steady, just like in the old days. He wasn't angry, only focused on protecting what was his. Suddenly, the ladder creaked. The man climbing up froze. "Hey, I think someone's been here." Before he could finish, Calvin spoke from the darkness outside the barn. His deep, commanding voice cut through the night like thunder. "You boys lost?" The men jumped, spinning around, flashlights shaking. They couldn't see him, only hear that steady, powerful voice. Rico cursed under his breath. "Who the hell is that?" Calvin stepped forward slowly until the faint moonlight revealed his face. Calm, steady, unafraid. His shotgun rested easily in his hands like an extension of himself. "Put your hands where I can see them," he said firmly. "You've got 10 seconds to walk out of my barn." The men hesitated, their confidence fading fast. This wasn't the scared old farmer they imagined. Something in his eyes, cold, sharp, trained, told them they had made a terrible mistake. One of them raised his gun, trying to act tough. "You don't scare us, old man." Calvin didn't flinch. "Son," he said quietly, "you should have stayed home tonight." Before the man could aim, Calvin fired a warning shot into the ground near his feet. The sound exploded through the night, echoing off the trees. The men stumbled back, terrified. Rusty barked fiercely from the porch, the sound adding to their panic. "Drop the gun," Calvin ordered. His tone was controlled but fierce, the voice of a commander used to being obeyed. The man dropped his weapon immediately. Another tried to run, but Calvin fired again, this time hitting the dirt near the exit. "Don't," he warned. "You take one more step and you'll regret it." The men froze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks of the barn. Calvin stood there, steady as a rock, watching them with calm eyes. He didn't want to kill anyone, but he wasn't going to let them hurt his home either. As the moon broke through the clouds, its light revealed the Marine Corps emblem tattooed on his arm. The men stared at it, realizing who they were dealing with. This wasn't just some farmer. This was a man who had survived war. And now, the war had come to him. The cartel had just learned their first lesson: never mistake silence for weakness. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air like a ghost. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of hay and oil from the barn. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The cartel men stood frozen, their flashlights shaking, breaths sharp and uneven. Across from them, Calvin Brooks stood tall, calm, and unshaken, his shotgun steady in his hands. The night felt heavy, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. "Now," Calvin said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence, "put your hands on your head, slowly." The men obeyed. They weren't brave anymore. The one who had called him old man earlier now stared at the ground, afraid to meet Calvin's eyes. There was something about that calm stare, cold, controlled, and confident, that told them he wasn't bluffing. Calvin moved closer, his boots crunching on the dirt floor. He studied their faces one by one, memorizing them. These weren't soldiers. They were young, nervous, and desperate, kids trying to act tough for a man who had led real fighters through real war. He spoke again, lower this time. "You picked the wrong barn." The men said nothing. Their leader, Rico, tried to steady his breathing. We didn't mean no harm," he stammered. "We thought this place was empty." Calvin didn't reply right away. He just watched them, thinking. He could tell they weren't alone. There had to be someone else out there, maybe a lookout or a driver. Years of experience told him this wasn't over. He finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Put whatever you brought on the ground. Bags, tools, everything." They dropped their duffels quickly, the sound of metal clinking inside revealing more than they wanted him to know. Calvin could hear it. Guns, money, maybe even something worse. He took a slow step back and gestured toward the exit with the barrel of his shotgun. "You're gonna walk out of here nice and slow. No sudden moves." As they stepped out into the night, the cold air hit their faces. The fields stretched wide and silent, moonlight glinting off the dewy grass. Rusty growled low from the porch, eyes glowing like two small embers. "Keep walking," Calvin ordered. They did, but Rico hesitated halfway down the path. He turned his head slightly and muttered, "You don't know who you're messing with, old man." Calvin's voice hardened. "Son, I've heard that before, from men who didn't live long enough to finish the sentence." "Keep walking." Rico swallowed hard and kept moving. When they reached the fence, Calvin stopped them. "You cross that line," he said, "and you don't ever come back. Not tomorrow, not next week, never." They nodded quickly, slipping through the gap they had cut earlier, then disappearing into the dark fields. For a moment it was quiet again. The danger seemed to fade with their footsteps, but Calvin didn't relax. He knew better than to think it was over. He stood there listening. The wind rustled through the trees. An owl hooted in the distance. Somewhere far off he thought he heard an engine start, then fade away. He walked back to the barn and looked around carefully. The duffel bags still sat on the ground where the men had dropped them. He knelt beside one and unzipped it. Inside were several small, tightly wrapped packages. Drugs, cocaine by the look of it. Calvin sighed deeply. "So that's what this is about," he muttered. He zipped the bag shut, then dragged it to the far corner of the barn. He wasn't about to leave it lying around. Whatever these men were into, it was bigger than just one break-in. He knew how operations like this worked. If these three had shown up tonight, more would follow. He walked back to his porch, sat down in his old rocking chair, and stared into the darkness. Rusty lay beside him, still growling softly, ears twitching. Calvin patted the dog's head. "Easy, boy. It's gonna get worse before it gets better." He looked toward the horizon where the faintest glow of dawn was starting to appear. It was the calm before the storm, the brief stillness before everything changed. In his mind, old instincts began to wake up. He thought about his years as a Marine commander, about strategy, traps, and defensive positions. If these men came back, they'd come back stronger and angrier. And this time they wouldn't just be carrying duffel bags. Calvin stood and stretched, his body aching but strong. He went back inside the house and opened a closet he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a locked trunk, his military chest. He ran his hand over the lid, remembering where it had been. The barracks, the ships, the battlefields. Then, without hesitation, he opened it. Inside were pieces of his past, neatly folded uniforms, old medals, a knife, and a smaller box marked supplies. He pulled out a few items, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a pair of heavy gloves, and a long piece of camo rope. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to call anyone, not yet. He wanted to see who would come next. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the crops like a whisper of warning. Rusty barked once, then fell silent again. Calvin poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, sat back down, and watched the sun begin to rise. To anyone driving by, it looked like an ordinary morning, an old farmer watching another day begin. But behind that calm, a warrior was awake again. Planning, preparing, waiting, because Calvin Brooks knew one thing for certain. When trouble knocks once, it always comes back harder, and this time, he would be ready. The sun rose quietly over the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. To anyone passing by, it looked like another peaceful morning on Calvin Brooks's farm. The chickens clucked, the wind moved gently through the corn, and Rusty lay in the shade, his tail flicking lazily. But inside Calvin's mind, the calm was gone. He had seen the look in those men's eyes, fear mixed with pride. He knew they would be back. Men like that didn't forgive humiliation, and they never came alone the second time. He had spent the early hours checking his land, studying every angle, every path leading to the barn. It wasn't just a field to him, it was a battlefield now. He mapped it out in his head the way he once did on foreign soil. Every tree, fence, and shadow had a purpose. Calvin didn't panic. He planned. That's what Marines did best. He started by reinforcing the barn. He took heavy chains and locked the main doors from the inside. Then he used old farming tools and scraps of wire to create makeshift traps, things that would slow down or confuse anyone who tried to get in. He wasn't trying to kill. He was trying to control. He wanted to show them that they had entered a place owned by a man who knew how to fight smart. By noon, he was working quietly near the porch, pretending to fix the gate. But his eyes kept shifting toward the road. Every time a car passed, he studied it. The sound of the engine, the rhythm of the tires, the glint of the windshield. He was waiting for the wrong one to appear, and just before sunset, it did. A dark SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road, dust rising behind it. Calvin didn't move. He kept his back turned, his hands steady on the gate. Rusty growled low, the hairs on his neck rising. 3 men stepped out of the SUV, not the same ones as before. These were older, harder, dressed in leather jackets and wearing dark sunglasses even though the sun was fading. One of them, tall and built like a wall, spat on the ground and muttered, "He's the one." Calvin turned slowly, wiping his hands with a rag. "Evening," he said calmly, as if greeting neighbors. The tallest man smirked. "You had a run-in with some of our boys last night." Calvin nodded slightly. "If you mean the trespassers who broke into my barn, yeah, we had words." The man's grin faded. "Those were my men." "Then you need better ones," Calvin said, his voice cool. The man took a step closer. You got guts, old man, but I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Calvin looked straight at him, his eyes steady. Son, I've spent a lifetime dealing with worse. There was silence for a long second. Then the man signaled his partners. Let's teach him some respect. The three started walking toward him. Calvin sighed quietly and muttered under his breath. Didn't want it to go this way. Rusty barked sharply, the sound echoing across the field. Calvin took one step back, reached behind the porch post, and pulled out the shotgun he'd leaned there hours ago, hidden in plain sight. The men froze. I said stop, Calvin ordered. His voice was calm but commanding, like a drill sergeant's. You take one more step and this conversation ends different. The tall man hesitated, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to being challenged. You gonna shoot us, old man? Calvin didn't blink. Only if I have to. Behind the barn, the wind picked up suddenly, kicking up dust. The air felt charged like before a storm. The leader laughed once, trying to hide his nerves. You don't scare us. Calvin tilted his head slightly. Then come find out. The next few seconds moved fast. The men reached for their guns, but Calvin had already fired once, not to hit, but to warn. The blast shattered the side mirror of their SUV and sent birds flying from the trees. Rusty barked wildly as the echo rolled across the land. The cartel men ducked behind the vehicle, shouting. One of them yelled, You're dead, old man. Calvin crouched low, moving behind the porch for cover. His breathing was steady. He wasn't angry or afraid, just focused, calculating distances, angles, and timing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal whistle. It was old scratched, a relic from his Marine days. He blew it once, sharp and loud. From the barn, a loud metallic sound followed, one of his traps snapping into place. A steel cable pulled tight across the side path, tripping one of the men who tried to flank him. The man fell hard, his gun flying from his hand. Calvin moved quickly, using the moment. He stepped out from behind the porch, aimed, and shot once more. The blast hit the ground inches from the man's feet. Stay down, he shouted. The others froze. The tall leader, realizing they were outmatched, growled, We'll be back, old man. You just made a big mistake. Calvin lowered his gun slowly. The only mistake was coming here. They scrambled into the SUV, the engine roaring as they sped off down the dirt road, dust clouding the air. Calvin stood there for a moment, shotgun in hand, heart steady. He watched until their taillights disappeared. Then he turned to Rusty and said softly, That's round 2, boy. They'll bring round 3 soon enough. He looked out over his land, his home, and felt the weight of what was coming. The cartel wouldn't stop, but neither would he. For now the farm was quiet again, bathed in the red glow of sunset. Calvin picked up the fallen gun, checked its weight, and smiled faintly. They think I'm just a farmer, he said to himself. Let's remind them what a Marine can do. As night fell, he returned to the barn to strengthen his defenses. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The next night came heavy and tense, like the sky itself was holding a secret. Clouds gathered low, blocking out the moon. The air felt thick, humid, the kind of stillness that happens right before a storm breaks. Calvin Brooks sat on his porch again, the same chair, the same cup of coffee in hand. But this time he wasn't just waiting. He was ready. He knew the cartel wouldn't take their defeat lightly. Men like that lived on pride and revenge. They couldn't stand losing, and especially not to an old man. They would return, and when they did, they'd come in greater numbers, angrier and more desperate. Inside the barn, the traps were set. Hidden wires, motion alarms made from tin cans and tools, and the steel trip cable he had stretched across the side path again. It wasn't fancy technology, just smart, simple, effective.
Calvin didn't need gadgets.
He had instincts sharper than any machine. Rusty was restless, pacing by the door, ears perked, nose twitching. Calvin reached down and rubbed the dog's head. You feel it too, huh? They're out there. And he was right. A mile down the road, 6 men sat in 2 black trucks with their engines off. Their leader, Luis Ortega, the same man who had ordered the operation and was there this time. He wasn't smiling. This is simple, he said coldly. We go in, we burn that barn to the ground, and we make sure that old fool never opens his mouth again. The men nodded, loading their weapons. They thought it would be easy. They didn't understand who they were walking into. Back at the farm, Calvin stood up slowly, set down his cup, and whispered to Rusty, Showtime. Boy. He moved quietly across the yard, his steps silent even on gravel. The air was so still he could hear every sound, every cricket, every rustle in the grass, every distant engine. And then he heard it, the faint growl of tires on dirt. Headlights off, moving slow. They were coming. Calvin slipped into the shadows near the barn. He didn't hide because he was scared. He hid because he wanted to control the fight. He wanted them to think he was asleep. He had learned long ago that fear could be a weapon. And he was about to use it. The first truck stopped by the fence. Doors opened. Men stepped out, their shoes crunching in the dirt. They whispered, moving fast, spreading out. Luis stood in the middle, holding a rifle. "Light it up," he said. One of the men pulled a gasoline can from the truck and started toward the barn. That's when it happened. A loud metallic snap echoed through the dark. The man froze. Then, before anyone could react, the ground beneath him gave way slightly. Calvin's trap. The man stumbled, tripped the steel wire, and went flying forward, his rifle clattering into the dirt. Instantly, lights burst from the barn, bright white beams Calvin had rigged from his tractor's headlights. The sudden glare blinded them. "Down!" one of them shouted, but it was too late. From the shadows, Calvin's voice boomed, deep, commanding, steady. "You boys just don't learn." The men panicked, firing blindly toward the light. Bullets ripped through wood and metal, sparks flying. Calvin stayed low, moving behind the tractor for cover, his shotgun held tight. Rusty barked furiously, his growls echoing like thunder. The sound made the men even more nervous. Luis tried to regain control. "Find him," he yelled. "He's just one old man." Calvin smirked. "One old man's all it takes." He fired once. Not at them, but at the gas can one of them had dropped. The shot hit dead center and a burst of flame shot upward, lighting the night in a fiery glow. The men screamed and stumbled back, the fire spreading fast. "Fall back!" one of them shouted. But Calvin was already moving, his body low and quick, circling behind the flames. He used the chaos to his advantage. Every sound, every shadow, every ounce of confusion. Luis spotted him through the smoke. "There, he's behind the tractor." He aimed his rifle, but Calvin had already ducked behind a haystack. Years of training had made him move like water, never in the same place twice. He grabbed a small flare from his pocket, one of the few military tools he had left, and tossed it into the air. The bright red light cut through the smoke, confusing the men even more. They didn't know where the shots were coming from anymore. Then Calvin's voice came again, calm and strong. "You should have stayed out of my barn." He stepped out just enough to fire again, this time hitting the ground near Luis's feet. The blast sent dirt flying. Luis stumbled backward, terrified for the first time in years. The other men started shouting, "We need to go. It's not worth it." Luis cursed and fired wildly toward the barn, but Calvin had already moved again, disappearing into the smoke. His voice came from somewhere else now, closer. "More dangerous. You bring fire to my land," Calvin said. "I'll show you what real fire looks like." He pulled another trick and a bucket filled with diesel that he had set up earlier. He kicked it over, and the flames spread fast, forming a barrier between him and the cartel men. They were trapped between fire and fear. One of them dropped his weapon and ran for the truck. Another followed. Luis screamed after them, but it was no use. Within minutes, the men were retreating, coughing and panicked, scrambling back into their vehicles. The truck sped off into the night, their tires throwing dirt into the air. Calvin stood still, breathing hard but steady, his shotgun at his side. The barn was scorched but still standing. Rusty trotted to his side, tail wagging, eyes bright. Calvin looked out toward the road where the cartel had vanished and said quietly, "That's right, run." The flames crackled around him, lighting up his face, they calm, fearless, and proud. The battle was over, but the war wasn't done yet. He knew they would return, maybe with more men, maybe with more guns, but that didn't scare him. He had faced worse, and he had survived every time. As the fire burned low and the night turned quiet again, Calvin whispered to himself, "You can't scare a man who's already lived through hell." And deep inside, he knew the fight had only just begun. Dawn broke slowly over the horizon, spreading a dull orange glow across the smoking fields. The air still smelled of gunpowder and burnt hay. The once silent barn now stood half-charred but still standing, strong, stubborn, unbroken. Calvin Brooks sat on the porch, his shotgun across his knees, his eyes watching the road. Rusty lay beside him, exhausted but alert, tail thumping weakly against the wooden floor. The night's fight was over, but Calvin knew this wasn't victory. It was just survival. He hadn't slept. His clothes were dusty, his arms scraped, and his face streaked with ash. But his gaze was steady. He wasn't thinking about fear or pain. He was thinking about the next move. The quiet morning was soon broken by the sound of sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder. A pickup truck followed by 2 sheriff's cars rumbled up the dirt road, tires crunching on gravel. Red and blue lights flashed against the smoke-filled dawn. Calvin didn't stand. He just watched as the vehicles came to a stop near the barn. Sheriff Tom Hargrove, a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, stepped out of his cruiser. He looked around at the burned patches, the bullet holes, the faint trail of tire marks leading back toward the highway. Then his gaze landed on Calvin, calm, still, sitting like a soldier after battle. "Morning, Calvin," the sheriff said carefully, taking off his hat. "Morning, Tom," Calvin replied, his voice rough but steady. Tom let out a slow whistle as he surveyed the damage. "Heard gunshots around midnight. Folks in town said they saw smoke. I told them, if Calvin Brooks is involved, I bet he's fine. Guess I was right." Calvin gave a faint smile. "Fine's one word for it." The sheriff walked closer, his boots crunching through the gravel. "What happened out here, Calvin?" Calvin looked toward the barn, then back at him. "Cartel. 3 men first night, 6 last night. Thought my barn was a good place to store their poison. Found out it wasn't," Tom frowned. "You mean the Ortega crew? We've been chasing them for months. You're telling me they came here?" Calvin nodded. "They picked the wrong farm." The sheriff stared at him, half impressed, half stunned. "You handled all this alone?" Calvin shrugged. "Didn't have much choice." Tom bent down, examining the ground. He saw shell casings, a burned gas can, footprints scattered everywhere. "Looks like a war zone," he muttered. "You could have been killed." Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Wouldn't be the first time." There was silence between them for a moment, the kind of silence that carried years of respect and unspoken understanding. Tom had known Calvin for decades, but he had never seen this side of him. "Back in the Marines," Tom said slowly. "They called you Commander Brooks, didn't they?" Calvin's jaw tightened slightly. "Used to," Tom nodded. "I read your file once. Led 3 missions in Afghanistan, 2 in Somalia. Bronze Star, Navy Cross. You never told anyone in town." Calvin looked away, his voice low. "I wasn't looking for medals anymore. Just peace." Tom nodded again, his voice softening. "Peace doesn't come easy to men like you." Calvin didn't answer. He just watched the wind blow through the charred grass. The sheriff sighed, looking back toward the road. "We'll send a team out here, get some protection for you. The cartel's not going to like this." Calvin shook his head. "No need, they won't come back the same way twice. And if they do..." He patted the shotgun lightly. "I'll be ready." Tom chuckled dryly. "You always are." He looked at the barn again. "You know you saved a lot of people last night. If they'd used this place to move their drugs, half the county would be flooded with it." Calvin didn't respond right away. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because it was right. After a while, he said quietly, "Sometimes doing the right thing means bringing the fight to your own doorstep." Tom nodded. "That's a Marine answer if I've ever heard one." The sheriff's deputies began marking the area, taking photos, collecting shell casings. One of them, a young rookie barely in his 20s, looked at Calvin in awe. "Sir, is it true you fought them off alone?" Calvin gave a faint smile. "I had help," he said, glancing down at Rusty, who wagged his tail proudly. The young deputy laughed nervously. "Guess they won't mess with you again." Calvin looked out toward the horizon, his face unreadable. "Oh, they'll try, but they'll learn. You don't sneak into a Marine's barn and walk away twice." Tom placed a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "You need anything, you call me. Day or night." Calvin nodded once. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." As the deputies drove off, leaving only a trail of dust, Tom lingered for a moment longer. He looked at the burned fields, the standing barn, and the quiet strength of the man who guarded it. "You know, Calvin," he said finally, "most men retire to forget their battles. You seem to find them waiting for you." Calvin gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe that's just the way it's meant to be." Tom nodded slowly. "Still, if you ever want to tell your story, people could use a hero like you." Calvin looked out over his land, the morning sun warming his face. "I'm no hero, Tom. Just a farmer who remembers how to fight." The sheriff smiled, put his hat back on, and walked to his car. As the engines faded into the distance, Calvin sat back in his chair, the silence returning to the farm. Rusty rested his head on his boots. The war was quiet again, for now. Calvin took a deep breath and whispered, more to himself than anyone, "You protect what's yours. Always." And as the sun climbed higher, lighting the old barn like a golden monument, one thing became clear. The legend of Calvin Brooks had only just begun. The days after the cartel's failed attempt passed in an almost unreal calm. Birds chirped in the morning, the wind danced softly through the cornfields, and Rusty ran freely across the yard, chasing shadows. For the first time in weeks, Calvin Brooks allowed himself a quiet smile. The barn still bore scars of fire and gunfire, but to him, those marks were not damage. They were proof of survival, proof of courage, proof of a man who had lived many lives in one. Word of the incident spread quickly through the county. Neighbors whispered about the old black farmer who had faced down armed men alone, who had stood his ground while bullets flew and fire burned around him. At first, people doubted it. How could one man, an old farmer, defeat a dangerous cartel? But when Sheriff Tom Hargrove confirmed the story, awe replaced doubt. Calvin became more than a man. He became a symbol. Yet Calvin never sought recognition. To him, fame was unnecessary. He didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to live in peace, tend his land, feed his animals, and watch the sun rise and set. But legends have a life of their own, and soon the story of the retired Marine who defended his farm against the cartel traveled far beyond the small town. Children would run to his porch, asking about the scary men and the explosions, eyes wide with curiosity. Calvin would chuckle, patting Rusty, and tell them stories, not of the violence, but of courage, patience, and thinking before acting. He taught them the lessons he had learned in life and in war. That strength isn't measured by muscle, but by calmness in chaos. That fear is temporary, but discipline lasts forever. And that protecting what you love is worth every risk. Farmers from nearby counties came to shake his hand. Neighbors left baskets of fresh food on his porch, and reporters tried to capture the story of a man who refused to be afraid. Calvin accepted their gestures politely, but kept his distance. His life had always been simple, and he intended to keep it that way. Every evening, he would sit on the porch with Rusty by his side, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Sometimes he thought about the men who had tried to break into his life, and he wondered if they had learned anything. He hoped they had. Calvin had no desire for revenge. He had only wanted to protect his home, and in doing so, he had reminded the world of an important truth. Courage does not fade with age. It only grows stronger with experience. The barn, once a simple structure, had become a symbol itself, the place where an ordinary life met extraordinary courage. Its walls carried the echoes of strategy, determination, and resilience. Calvin repaired the barn slowly, carefully reinforcing it, not because he feared the cartel would return, but because it deserved to stand as a testament to survival and ingenuity. Even Sheriff Hargrove, who had known Calvin for decades, admitted privately that he had never seen anyone like him. "That man," he said, shaking his head, "faced death and chaos and still stood taller than anyone I've known. He's a hero, whether he calls himself one or not." Calvin smiled quietly at the thought. He didn't need validation. The lessons of his life had already spoken louder than any praise ever could. He had been a Marine, a farmer, a neighbor, and now, in the eyes of the people, a legend. As the seasons passed, life returned to its natural rhythm. Fields grew green again, the barn stood strong, and the stories of that fateful night became tales whispered around dinner tables, campfires, and schoolyards. Calvin never bragged. He never boasted. He simply lived quietly, watching over his land and teaching others the true meaning of bravery. And in the quiet moments, when Rusty rested his head on his boots and the wind rustled through the pine trees, Calvin Brooks allowed himself one small truth. Legends are not born from seeking glory. They are born from standing firm when everything else threatens to fall. On the edge of town, with smoke long gone and the sun shining golden on his farm, the man who once commanded soldiers in distant lands had shown his greatest command yet, the ability to defend, endure, and inspire. And from that day forward, the name Calvin Brooks became more than a farmer's name. It became a symbol of courage, resilience, and the unwavering spirit of a man who never backed down, no matter the odds.